Hey everyone, and thanks for joining us today for our second webinar in our Impact Huddle series. I'm Ryan Kuriakos, the marketing lead here at Midnition, and we're excited to have you join us today for a fantastic session led by Dr. Deb Delaney on cultural change and the power of learning from mistakes. Now, I'm sure some of you have joined today solely as part of the Deb Delaney fan club, but for those of you who don't know Deb, she has over 25 years of emergency nursing experience and has served in nearly every role in the emergency department, from transporter to ED director. She spent several years in healthcare consulting, helping hospital administrators with process improvement, customer service, and employee engagement. We're fortunate enough to have Deb join us here at Midnition as our clinical implementation lead, helping emergency nurses at hospitals across the country get started with Kate AI. Now, before I get started, I wanted to go into a few different housekeeping items. The webinar is recorded, and we will be emailing a copy of the recording. Everyone is automatically muted, but if you have any questions, please feel free to add them in the questions box at any time. It's on the bottom right in the corner. And we'll have dedicated time to answer any questions at the end. And last but not least, have fun. Interact with Deb during the presentation using that react button you see on the screen. I'm sure she'll love the real-time feedback. Thank you, and with that, I'll pass it off to Deb.
Oh, Ryan, thank you so very much. It's so great to be here. I wish we were live and in person. I'm not as technologically sound as I am live, but I thank you all for joining. And I just want to share with you what we will be covering today. So with that, I'll start with the objectives. Thanks, Ryan. So what I want to talk about is, first of all, the history of healthcare, or as I would call it, where we were. I'd like to talk about where we are currently in healthcare, or as you would say, where we are. I want to talk a little bit about the characteristics of high reliability and just culture, which is where we need to be. And then I want to share with you some strategies that are being utilized in hospitals to help improve patient safety, or better said, how we get there. Well, the first question is simply, how big of an impact are preventable medical errors? This study in 2018 shows death by medical errors is third only to heart disease and cancer. Of course, in 2020, everything changed, and for the first time, COVID replaced preventable medical errors in third place. And last year again, preventable errors fell behind COVID. I guess that's one thing we can be thankful for COVID for. Well, just how many deaths are we talking about? Estimates vary and range anywhere from 98,000 to 400,000 deaths per year attributed to hospital errors. The fact that these estimates range so greatly is in itself cause for concern that mistakes are underreported or not reported at all. And if they are reported, then where is this information recorded? Shouldn't we know? So let's take a look back where we were. So at the beginning of the last century, medicine was not what it is today. Science was considered nice to have. And while there were many independent medical schools, only 16 required more than a high school education. You could also simply purchase a diploma in the mail for $100. It may go without saying that if science was nice to have in medical school, imagine what you learned in the mail. In 1910, the Flexner Report was the first attempt at any kind of standardized curriculum for medical schools. John Brinkley, who was considered a U.S. surgeon, I use that term loosely, he spent the $100 to purchase his degree at a diploma mill, the completely legitimate sounding Kansas City Eclectic Medical University. And by the early 1920s, he began targeting as his patients men who were concerned about their manly vigor. His surgery included sticking pieces of goat testicles into patients, not attaching them to anything, so the glands quickly dried up and died. And so did many of his patients, usually from infection. After witnessing one of these operations in 1931, the Kansas Medical Board instantly revoked his license. He was sued more than a dozen times. He ultimately died in 1942 before he was ever brought to trial. If this sounds too ridiculous to be true, you might want to stay tuned for the upcoming documentary starring Matt Damon as U.S. Surgeon John Brinkley. So by 1940, we continue learning. Dr. Moniz was a Portuguese neurosurgeon best known for developing the leucotomy. It seemed like such a good idea at the time. It won the most prestigious award in science in 1949, the Nobel Prize. It's better known in America as a lobotomy. It was intended to alleviate madness and suffering in violent and psychotic people. Here is the American doctor Walter Freeman performing the insertion of an ice pick-like instrument through a person's tear duct, piercing into the brain, then wiggling the tool back and forth in the prefrontal cortex. He then repeats the process in the other eye socket. The whole procedure took around 10 minutes. By 2006, it was decreed the worst idea on the mind in history. The 1950s saw great advances in the detection and cure of illness. Doctors readily prescribed and patients gladly received treatment. Moms found Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup very effective at reducing children's coughing. Cocaine toothache drops were a hit, and who couldn't use a little mercury in their open wounds? While still available today, the US government more closely began regulating controlled substances in the 1970s. Mercurochrome, however, was effectively banned. Thalidomide, also was in the 1950s, was advertised as harmless as a sugar cookie. Thalidomide was known to ease effects of morning sickness in pregnant moms. It was removed in 1962 after causing major birth defects. Advertising in the 1960s was very influential. Nearly half of all US adults were cigarette smokers. More doctors smoked Camel than any other cigarettes. And cigarettes were distributed to patients in hospitals. It was believed to reduce their appetite and relieve their anxiety. In this ad, this lovely pregnant woman says, "People always tell me that smoking causes low birth weights." Well, that's a win-win-win. I'll have an easy labor, a slim child, and the full flavor of my Winston cigarette. Lawsuits turned the tide against the tobacco industry in the mid-90s. Even today, however, only 28 states have 100% smoke-free indoor air laws. So mistakes create change, or I guess better said, mistakes sometimes create change. So let's look at some specific moments in time that mistakes prompted changes in healthcare. In 1976, Dr. Jim Steiner, an orthopedic surgeon, crashed his small plane in a cornfield in rural Nebraska, sustaining serious injuries. His wife was killed and his 4 children were critically injured. His personal tragedy highlighted the need for immediate care post-trauma. He aligned with other surgeons to create a system to improve care in the first golden hour. We know that now as advanced trauma life support. In 1980, the American College of Surgeons adopted and began disseminating his course worldwide. In 1985, the Anesthesia Patient Safety Foundation was created. This was created after the 2020 documentary highlighting the danger of anesthesia. Its founders created the very first patient safety organization and was the first to coin the term patient safety, igniting a movement that is now universal in healthcare. In 1995, Betsy Lehman, who was a health reporter for the Boston Globe, was 39 years old when she suddenly died at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. It was a tragic reminder of the risk associated with cancer care. Betsy received 4 times the dose of chemo just as she was preparing to go home. Ironically, the error was discovered by clerks when they later entered the data, not by the clinicians who cared for her. That public humiliation to Dana-Farber and their cancer treatment helped launch the patient safety movement. In 2001, 18-month-old Josie King overdosed on methadone at the Johns Hopkins Medical Center. Josie King's mom used this powerful story to create curriculum to educate hospital staff. Some of you may have been trained in the 16-week curriculum, which educates and inspires caregivers. In 2007, the actor Dennis Quaid sued Baxter when his twin babies were administered heparin in 10,000 unit vials instead of the 10 units they should have been given. His lawsuit helped Baxter and other drug companies with improved labeling, font style, the different background colors that we see, and the red alert tear-off tabs that have become more common to us on medication. In 2008, a little girl was mistriaged in the emergency department. It was diagnostic momentum from a triage error, creating a cascade of events that led to every parent's worst nightmare. Well, Kate recovered, and her dad and uncle used her story to help clinicians care for patients. That's where Mednition, the company I now work for, was founded. This artificial intelligence software allows nurses to more quickly identify high-risk situations before it's too late. So we talk about high reliability and high reliability organizations. What does that mean? Well, the industries first to embrace high reliability concepts were those in which past failures had led to catastrophic consequences. Airplane crashes, nuclear reactor meltdowns, failed landing on an aircraft carrier. One misstep has potential for catastrophic failure, yet these industries still perform nearly error-free. Regarding healthcare, wouldn't you agree that our world is one considered hazardous? And wouldn't you hope that we exhibit a high level of safety over long periods of time? Is there a way we can apply HRO strategy to what we do every day? Certainly, the Institute of Medicine felt that by improving systems, we will improve safety, and that fixing the system would thus support its people in their report to Err Is Human, where they specifically stated the problem is not bad people in healthcare. It's that good people are working in bad systems that need to be made safer. High reliability has a set of guiding principles. The principle of anticipation is those principles which help you to stay out of trouble. The principles of containment are those which help you get out of trouble. These are the three principles of anticipation we'll talk about more. But they're like the pieces of the layers of Swiss cheese. They're the different ways to keep us safe and keep us out of trouble. The principles of containment are the ones that control the trouble or control the damage when the trouble hits us. Overall, high reliable organizations understand that errors will happen, but they won't disable the organization. So the first principle is the principle of the sensitivity to operations. It's what we consider situational awareness. It's looking for holes in the Swiss cheese. It's when leaders get out and round, give real-time guidance and the right resources to help their team stay safe. It's having a good sense of individuals' talents and skills within your department, knowing who your high performers are, and noticing risk and preventing them. It's all about communication and data sharing. The second principle is the reluctance to simplify. Simplistic explanations for why things work or don't are discouraged. In a high reliable organization, we don't automatically jump to an answer. Oh, the unqualified staff or inadequate training, it was a communication failure, etc. We discourage that kind of quick answer. Digging deeper is essential to understand the true reason for patient risk, and that we should question explanations that seem too reasonable or too obvious, because the very opposite may be true. We need not be afraid to ask more questions and voice even more concerns. We discuss alternatives about how to go about our day-to-day activity. We think before we act. And if we make an assumption, we check with others to justify before proceeding. The third is preoccupation with failure. Near misses are considered opportunities to improve. You can see by that picture that the reported failures and injuries are just the tip of the iceberg. Rather than accept the system has effective safeguards, we need to spend time identifying the activities that we don't want to go wrong. We need to discuss and look out with members of our team and the oncoming team. Take time to attend to detail and remember to destigmatize failure. Rather than accept we're okay, we need to say, what could we do better? The next two are, once something does happen, how do we mitigate it? The first is deference to expertise. HROs take advantage of the unique skills of each colleague. When a crisis occurs, they pool collective expertise to resolve it. Rather than a team of experts, they're considered an expert team. HROs recognize that the person at the bedside best understands the risk that patients really face. HROs understand that leaders and supervisors must listen and respond to the insight of staff who know how things really work, who know what happens on the night shift or on Saturday at 3 in the afternoon when no leaders are present. It's important that you ask new employees what worked at their last hospital. They may be a wealth of information of how to do it better than to say, oh, we've always done it this way. Resilience is the fifth tenet. Leaders and staff train and prepare to know how to respond when the failures do occur. All the staff know the why. Being aware of what's going on around them, HROs identify errors as they are occurring and correct them before they get worse and cause more harm. Doing disaster drills is a perfect example of training for an event that could happen and what we can do better to prevent it or mitigate the risk. HRO communication exists on common language. We use some of these techniques in most healthcare settings, but hospitals who live by high reliable standards use them and use them all the time. SBAR is a great way to hand off when communicating about a problem. Most of us have heard about situation, background, assessment, and recommendation. Asking clarifying questions, especially in high-risk situations or when the information is just not clear. For example, if the doctor says to you, I want you to round on the patient frequently, you might ask, well, shall I do that every 10 minutes? Every 30 minutes? Is rounding once an hour what you want me to do? The phonetic alphabet, as is used in the military, works with us when we need to clarify. And it doesn't really matter if D is for Delta or Duck or David, as long as when you use the word and clarify D as in Delta, what's important is that you clarify. Three-way repeat back and read back happens when the sender says information, the receiver repeats what they just heard and asks if that's what they meant, at which time the sender of the information will say, yes, that is correct, or no, that is not correct. One other method of common language used in high reliable organizations is suggesting that staff members are very comfortable to cuss. And I don't just mean those of us that live in the Boston area, because we're very comfortable to cuss. What I mean is that you're able to say, I'm concerned, I'm uncomfortable. If there's an immediate threat, we need to make sure we're able to say this is a safety issue. Stop the line. This language is used to stop any action and reassess the situation so that everyone is on the same page before continuing. And all you need to say is, please stop the line. I need clarity. These are some of the common tools used in common language in HRO communication. So, what is just culture? We've heard a lot about just culture recently, and just to clarify, I want to be sure we appreciate that it's not punitive, nor is it blame-free, but that just culture is somewhere in the middle where we expect and appreciate balanced accountability. In a punitive culture, I consider it too hard, which, by the way, healthcare historically isn't a punitive culture. It was always a top-down system. Healthcare has always been paternalistic, and nurses were considered handmaidens. The expectation of perfection abounds, and often in a punitive culture, we manage mistake by focusing on the individual who made the mistake. There's little consideration for system flaw. There's little direction on how to improve, and there's no provision ahead of time to mitigate the risk. What happens in a punitive culture? Well, the results are no news is good news. Threats inhibit reporting. We blame the clinician as incompetent or uneducated or unwilling. and we weed out these bad performers. So ultimately, mistakes are driven underground. We fear being fired, we fear losing our license, and we feel much better keeping our mouth shut and not admitting our mistake. A blame-free culture is when the pendulum swings the other way and it really becomes too soft. In a blame-free culture, perfect is not achievable. We understand that humans are fallible. There is increased error reporting. There is always a system review of near misses. We're not afraid to share our near misses and then review them. But the employee is held harmless. We look deeper at the system and then we implement change. While the result of a blame-free culture is the failure to confront individuals when needed, those that are willfully non-compliant, or those that repeatedly make unsafe behavior choices, or those that knowingly disregard the risk, causes a lack of credibility and sense of justice. The good people end up leaving because the poor performers aren't held accountable and everything falls back to the system. So what is just culture? Well, the punitive culture has no transparency. It's not that. The blame-free culture has no accountability. It's not that. The just culture is considered balanced accountability. It's just right. So in order to speak about corrective action, we need to understand what types of mistakes are we talking about? What type of errors occur? Well, the first is human error. It's an inadvertent slip. It's a lapse, a mistake. Nobody goes to the gas station and says, I think I'll drive away with the gas pump still attached to my car. It's simply an error. It's a human error, and it wasn't intentional. It's our goal to console that person. Oh my God, I know that could have happened to me. One time I was talking and I didn't pay attention. I could have done the same thing. The second type of error is considered at-risk behavior. It's a choice we make, but it seems justified or no big deal. We know we should drive with our hands on 10 and 2, or 9 and 3, I guess these days, but we need to finish our coffee, we need to take this phone call, and of course we need to put on our makeup. This is a choice that it seems justified, in which case we need to coach. And then there's reckless behavior. There is a conscious disregard of sustainable and unjustifiable risk. I know the light is red. I know I'm in a hurry. I'm just going to run the red light, and whatever happens, happens. That is reckless behavior, and that needs to be disciplined. So let's talk about how that would impact us in our world in healthcare. Human error. At no point in time when you're setting the pump do you ever think, gee, I think I'm going to set this for 1,000 mLs an hour, not 100. You just happened to hit the zero one extra time. It was inadvertent. It was a slip. It was a lapse. It was a mistake. It was a product of system design. You need to be consoled, and the system needs to be fixed. At-risk behavior is when you make a choice that you know you shouldn't, but you feel it's justified or no big deal. You need to override the Pyxis because you have a code coming in. You need to override the Pyxis because this patient needs his meds and he's not in the MAR yet. So you make a choice that seems justified. It's risk-taking, but it's unintentional, at which time you need to be coached. And then there's reckless behavior, which I guess at no point should we come to work drunk. That is conscious disregard of substantial and unjustifiable risk. That is intentional risk-taking. You know you shouldn't do it. You can't even make an excuse about it. And then you need to be disciplined. So where are we in healthcare? We know what the mistakes are. We know what just culture looks like. We've heard a little bit about what high reliability sounds like and is. Where are we exactly? Well, according to this survey that was done in 2021, 38% of staff members believe that mistakes are held against them. 42% believe it's the person who's being written up, not the problem. And 35% of staff members feel there's no support for staff involved in patient safety errors. How do healthcare leaders see this versus staff? 95% of healthcare leaders believe that hospitals handle events fairly. 65% of staff believe the same. 92% of leaders believe that employees receive objective and fair follow-up. 60% of employees feel the same. 52% of leaders feel that staff member is blamed in events. 76% of staff think they're blamed. 62% of leaders think that staff members fear disciplinary action when they're involved in an event. 84% of staff do fear it. 92% of leaders do believe that they are easily approachable and that all staff can easily approach their supervisor with any concerns they have or any ideas for improvement. 66% of staff concur. 92% of leaders believe that improvements come when events are reported, but only 63% of staff feel the same way. Yet, we're doing some things right. Patient bed alarms are pretty much a standard across the country. It is common for us to foam in, foam out, gel in, gel out. Hand hygiene is something we are doing right. We do have improved lettering, tall man lettering, look-alike, sound-alike drugs. Most all of us have this somewhere in our med room. We're not afraid to speak up when necessary. We're not afraid to say stop the line in most places. We know about the right site and wrong site markings prior to surgery. We also are very good with pre-op checklists or checklists of other kinds as well. Thanks to Baxter and the pharmaceutical industry, we do have very good tagging on look-alike, sound-alike, high-risk medications. And we also are very aware of a no-talk zone or a no-interrupt zone when nurses are dispensing or mixing medications. So as a system across the nation, we have learned a lot of things and we're doing them right. In just culture, how far have we come? If you're a healthcare provider and you've not heard of Redonda Vaught and her case, I will just refresh in your memory. Redonda withdrew vercuronium instead of Versed. She gave a patient a paralytic instead of a sedative, which ultimately caused the patient's death. She admitted the error as soon as she realized it, yet she went on to be charged with reckless homicide. Criminal charges were filed only against the nurse, not against the system. And at her trial, the prosecution called a paid nursing expert who stated on the stand she had never heard of just culture. I'm not here to pass judgment on our legal system. My question for you is, how embedded is just culture in healthcare if a nursing expert in 2022 has never heard of it? One other thing I'd like to talk about is outcome bias. In a just culture, the outcome should never determine or influence the response to the individuals involved in the event. What if Redonda's mistake, instead of pulling vecuronium versus Versed, she in fact pulled Valium instead of Versed? She did the exact same thing by pulling the wrong med. But in Redonda's case, the prosecution's outcome bias led directly to the criminal charges. If the very same event had happened but had not resulted in a patient's death, would it have then resulted in criminal charges? We must be mindful that the severity of the event should never influence the way we respond to the event. So how do we change the culture? What are we supposed to do? Well, let's first talk about what the cultures look like. The culture of blame versus the culture of accountability. In a culture of blame, the culture believes that people are the problem and that mistakes are bad. In a culture of accountability, we believe that the people solve problems and that mistakes are learning opportunities. In a culture of blame, we focus on who is wrong. The individual is the issue. We find fault. We consider the past and we consider punishment. In a culture of accountability, we ask, what is wrong? We focus on process issues. We are fact finding, not fault finding. We look to the future and how to improve. The result of that is, in a culture of blame, we make assumptions. We point fingers at the other guy. We don't trust anybody else. We end up with silos and turf wars. It wasn't our department. It wasn't me. It wasn't the night shift. We're risk averse and we wait and see what happens. In a culture of accountability, we consider the alternatives. We learn from mistakes. We trust, not distrust. We have cross-functional cooperation. We don't mind taking risks. We take calculated risks, and we're given permission to try new things. We are allowed to take initiative to see if we can't make things better. I'd like to say in the culture of blame, we have this guy, Mr. Blame, and in the culture of accountability, we have this guy, Mr. Accountable. Let's talk about these two guys. In a culture of blame, we ask why, when, who. In a culture of blame, we complain that our hospital has high turnover. We're special. We're unique. We have a lot of behavioral patients. We have a lot of homeless patients. We have a lot of issues. We're short-staffed. In an accountable organization, we say, we have those issues also, but what can we do about it? How can we address it? We need to fix the system to support the people, not the other way around. So if you were given this infection rate percentage by hospital, you would see that in the blame culture, Mr. Blame would say, who is responsible for these high infections? Nurses need to be more careful. Why did this happen? And then look at the graph and say, wow, we're still better than the other five. We're like in the top 5. Mr. Accountable would say, I should ask the team for suggestions. How are we going to work together to reduce these infections? What is happening that we can address? I know we're in 5th place, but how can we get to the best we can be? What is it we can do together? In a situation where nurses are tired and hungry and weary and haven't had a drink, they're feeling dehydrated. In the culture of blame, Mr. Blame would find a cup and say, "Whose drink is this? Don't they know the rules? We need to write them up." He would promptly post this notice and say, "You know the rules. There's no eating or drinking in this area." Mr. Accountable would say, "Is there something we can do about it? Let's ask the team what they would like to see happen here. Perhaps we can put in hydration stations strategically located throughout the department where nurses could stop and have a drink. In fact, there are hospitals out there like Dignity Health, Lenox Hill Hospital in New York City, St. Luke's Hospital, many hospitals who not only have put in these hydration stations, they've also given their team members swag. They have their own water bottles that they can decorate the way they want, and also reduce plastic waste. That's asking your team and being creative. Does anyone have a waiting room that looks like this? If you work in a hospital today, I'm sure your answer is yes. Triage is hard. Research cited on the Emergency Nurses Association website concludes that triage nurses, on average, mistriage 40% of all patients on arrival. We get it right 60% of the time. Now, Mr. Blame would say, we need to re-educate those nurses. They shouldn't even go to triage. What is wrong with our educators? Somebody needs to get on top of that manager. How dumb is that staff? Mr. Accountable would say, well, reasons are many why triage nurses triage the way they do. We still never want to miss high-risk patients. Can we leverage the thoughtful application of AI technology to help patients and our nurses on the front line? And for this, I would like to shout out Adventist Health System, Sparrow Health System, the University of Massachusetts for their forward-thinking, LMH for their forward-thinking response to triage errors, because they have all introduced Kate to help reduce the risk of errors for patients at triage. In this example, when staffing is an issue and your staff is beaten down and exhausted and unwilling to work, you need to know that what has worked in the past is not going to take us to the future. Mr. Blame can buy us all the pizza that he wants. We need to fix the system to support our people. Remember that just culture doesn't happen just because you made it a policy. Improved staffing is not a nice to have. It's critical. We need to learn how to empower frontline staff to guide decisions. Mr. Accountability would have us having focus groups, rounding, shared governance model to inquire from the team, what is it that you need? What is it that would work for you? How can you help us help our patients? And how can we do this together? A few final thoughts. First off, mistakes are going to happen. Blame is often assigned before all the facts are known, and it assumes that people, not the systems they operate in, are the problem. Blame is focused on the past and on punishing the offender. The belief is if we punish the offender, that will correct their poor behavior. The reality is the only thing people learn from being blamed is to become better at hiding their mistakes. Accountability is not the same thing as blame or even the same thing as punishment. To be accountable means to take responsibility for the results, whether they're good or bad. It means finding solutions to problems and applying lessons learned in order to improve future results. Being accountable is constructive because it focuses on the future. Remember that healthcare professionals are human and humans make mistakes. A culture that punishes people for admitting their errors is bad for everyone. If we aren't talking about our mistakes, we aren't fixing them. And if others made the same mistake before you, but you didn't know about it, you won't be able to learn from it and therefore not repeat it. In closing, I'd like to add some words from the great coach Bear Bryant. When you make a mistake, there are only 3 things you should ever do about it: admit it, learn from it, and don't repeat it. Any questions or comments, I'd be happy to take. I tried to leave a good 10 minutes. It looks like I've got 15.
Thanks, Deb. That was awesome. We had a few questions did come in. I'll share them. So one is, I know hindsight is 2020, but is there a way to be proactive on risk versus reactive?
Well, I think part of those high reliability organizational tenets help with that. Don't just jump to conclusions, looking ahead to what might happen. You know, the perfect example was the wet floor sign. Before I wash the floor, I put the wet floor sign there so that you know it's coming. That does happen in our world. It's probably not the greatest example for a nurse, but for us to be proactive and try to think ahead what might happen.
Perfect. Thank you.
Good question. Thank you.
And if anybody else has questions, there's a questions box on the bottom right, so you can just share there. So what would you say or respond to leadership that is non-clinical and yet have influence over clinical operations?
Oh, hi, Alex. Great question. What, are you trying to trip me up? Of course, you would have to help them understand walking in our shoes. And I think that non-clinical leaders are looking at things from a different angle. By them walking the walk with us helps us help them appreciate our world. I often say, you know, you think of the administrators that walk through the ER and they're like, oh my God, they have no idea what really goes on. So to gently coax them and encourage them to come and see how things really work and what it's like in our unit, in our department, wherever that is, the voice of the people. Good question.
Deb, how do you identify an HRO or just culture organization? Is there a certification, accreditation, such as quality awards?
Yeah, so there is training. In fact, if you liked the high reliability information, I actually created an educational program. It was in 2020 and I was going to deliver it live, and then, you know, COVID came along, so the conference was canceled. But there is a lot of training resources in a high reliable organization and for just culture strategies. There's no stamp that you get. And I always say that, you know, just because it's a policy at your hospital doesn't make it real. It's organizational, cultural change. It's the way we do business. It's how we operate here. And so that's really learning the strategies, sharing the strategies, ensuring your staff stay current and are not afraid. You saw those surveys where staff members don't agree with their leadership on perception. So getting out and getting around and living those tenets every day.
Awesome. Thanks. I think those are the questions. Thank you, Deb. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today for today's Impact Huddle. As a reminder, you will get the recording via email today. And we'd love your feedback on the session. So please let us know if you have any additional feedback in the polls. And thank you all, and have a great day.
Or if any other topics you have a dying desire to learn about, let us know, because Ryan has created these impact huddles, and we would love to navigate around questions and issues that you all are seeing out there that we can do some research and help you with. So please feel free to let us know either way.
Thank you all.
Thank you.